Hello, everybody, and welcome to webinar number 5 in our ongoing series here at the Endurance Hub. Like the last couple of episodes, we're going to talk about some terminology, some lingo, as I call it, um, about the various different sports. Now, if you've been doing this for a while and you're tuning in, the last few episodes might be a little bit slow for you. I'm sure you know most of this stuff, but really, what we're trying to do is cater to the beginner crowd in this moment. Speaking from experience, at one time I was a beginner, as was everybody, and I think one of the things I stumbled on initially, which I found a little bit frustrating, was just the language. It took a little while to learn some of the language, and of course, once you learn it, it's much easier to sort of follow along. If you're at a group workout and the coach is talking, or you're getting an online program, certainly if you know the terminology, it's much easier to get down to business and do what you're there for. So today, we're going to follow along the same theme. So, a couple episodes ago, we did swim lingo, where we talked about some of the terminology you might hear in and around the swimming pool or the open water, or in your program. Last week, we did bike lingo, same idea. Touched on a bunch of different terms and phrases that will hopefully help you learn the language. And today, of course, we're gonna dive into run lingo. Now, arguably the easiest of the three. Running's one of my favorite sports because it's so simple, and doesn't really require any equipment other than shoes. Um, Obviously, today in this time we have dozens and dozens of products for running as well. But really, when you break it down, you need a decent pair of shoes, and off you go. But I would like to dive into some other terminology today as well. Some of it is a little higher level, but I think if you're in this sport, certainly if you're looking at stuff online, you might hear some of the terms I'm going to throw at you today. And I think rather than hearing them and being overwhelmed and thinking, "Oh my gosh, why are they making running so complicated?" Uh, the goal today is really just to provide you with some of the terms that will help you, help you understand the language. So let's dive into a little presentation today. Um, Hopefully you can all see that. And here we go. Running lingo, or run lingo. So first thing, some really basic equipment needs, and I broke this up into two different categories: summer and fall/winter. Now, obviously, this depends on where you live. I'm coming at you from the Great White North here in Canada. Well, not really the Great White North. I'm over in Victoria, which is uh, not typically winter, but we get very wet and cool and damp winters. Not like your traditional Canadian winter, but still we have to be dressed for it at certain times of year. Obviously, if you're down south, Florida or somewhere in the southern US, or other parts of the world that doesn't experience winter, then some of this is irrelevant for you. But if you really love equipment, then maybe you want to get some of this anyway in case you travel. I always recommend that if people are going to travel, that they have a broader range of equipment, especially apparel, just so they're prepared. The last thing you want to do is arrive at some cool destination and now you don't have the right gear to run with. So, really simple. Again, I think running is one of my favorite sports because the equipment needs are so minimal. So, we'll start with the summer. We got shorts, obviously. Shorts can be, there are run specific shorts. So, again, if you are brand new to this sport, you might want to pick up some running specific shorts. Usually they're a little bit shorter. They sometimes have a cut up the side, so the fabric moves a little bit easier when you're running. Nothing is worse than running in a long pair of baggy board shorts. They'll get in your way. They're kind of cumbersome. They might cause some chafing. So really, if you are going to get into running and you're brand new, go to a running shoe store, ideally locally owned one, and grab yourself a pair of proper running shorts. A good t-shirt or a singlet. So we've come a long way in the fabric industry. There's lots of great apparel now that is specifically designed for running, usually a little bit lighter weight, wicks away moisture. and just feels better on your body when you're running. So again, if you're brand new and you're using board shorts and a generic kind of t-shirt, it's probably not going to be as comfortable in the long run. Don't let that stop you by all means. If you if that's all you have and you really want to get into running, don't let this side of it slow you down. Get out there for sure. But if you're going to do some longer runs and you're really going to get stuck into it, it's a worthwhile investment to get a nice setup so that you're comfortable running. Obviously, today's day and age, the sun's pretty intense, so a hat or a visor is a good idea. Again, there are running specific hats that are very comfortable. They breathe a little bit more, maybe a little more lightweight than a traditional baseball hat. So, not a bad idea to pick one up, and it's good to protect your face from the sun. And I personally just like running in a hat. I'm not sure why. I don't really have a reason other than that, if the sun's really blaring, it kind of keeps the sun out of my eyes, which is nice. Sunscreen, obviously. There are sport specific sunscreens. So again, if you're brand new to this sport, you can go to a pharmacy and get the generic off the shelf sunscreens, but there are sunscreens now specifically designed for people who do sports. Little lighter, little less kind of thick and creamy, more, you usually can spray them on, and it's just a little more comfortable. Usually they're sweat resistant too. I think some of them are water resistant. So if you're going to swim outside, it's not a bad idea to have some sport specific sunscreen. Chafing cream, you hear me talk about this a lot. Nothing's worse than, getting chafing in any of the sports, whether it's swimming, biking, or running. It's such a silly way to be slowed down when all it takes is some decent chafing cream to keep you going. And then a nutrition belt or a running pack. So this is only really relevant if you're getting into running that probably exceeds an hour, certainly 90 minutes. I know, like, I have no problem going for a run of 60 to 90 minutes without any nutrition. But that's just me. I've been doing it for a long time. I know my limits. But certainly, if the conditions are very hot, if you live in a hot climate, or you're tackling some longer distance running, become very popular these days, the endurance running, the ultra running crowd, you should really invest in a good nutrition belt or a running pack. Um, they're not all created equal. This is not a backpack that you throw on that you would go for a hike with. This is a running specific pack. And if you are getting into some runs that are exceeding certainly 2 hours, 3, 4 hours, you need to get yourself a good nutrition pack. Uh, for safety. I mean, that's a big reason. In there, you can have maybe a little first aid kit. You have the fluids you need. You have the nutrition you need. Really important, especially if you're heading out into the trails and you're going to be out there for 2, 3, 4 hours. Be prepared. The body has enough, glycogen reserves, muscle glycogen reserves for about 90 minutes. You can probably get away with it for a couple hours. But if you run out, it's an awful feeling. And if you're way out in the bush, maybe you've lost your way a little bit. It's better to be over prepared and have what you need. Let's move to fall and winter. So you might want to invest in a nice pair of running tights. Certainly out here on the West Coast, we can get away with shorts most of the year, but there's the odd week that it cools down, and I like running in tights. I'm a big believer in keeping the leg muscles warm. You won't regret it if you keep the leg muscles warm. If they're cold and it's just not. I don't think it's as nice a way to run, and certainly probably predisposes you a little bit more to injury if the muscles are cold. But throw a good running tight on there, warm them up, and it's going to feel a lot better. And then, t-shirt or a long sleeve shirt. This is where we kind of got to get into layering. You've probably heard that term before. If it's really cold, you probably want to head out with a couple of layers. So let's say, for example, I was in, eastern part of Canada or Alberta or, one of the cooler states in the US, and say it's -10, -15. I would probably head out for a run with a t-shirt, a long sleeve shirt over that, and a light running jacket over that. So I'd have 3 layers. If it's really cold, then I'm probably going to be good with those layers the whole time. But let's say I'm doing a harder set and I warm up a little bit. Maybe I take that light jacket off, wrap it around my waist. For the main set, I'm really warm. And now I can do the main set a little bit more comfortably. And then in the cool down, I have, a light kind of windbreaker jacket to throw on after. Again, I'll reiterate how important it is if you're heading out into the woods for those long runs. Really, really important to be prepared in this area as well. Layering is super, super important, especially if you get stuck out there for some reason. You want to make sure you have the equipment that you're going to need to stay warm. A hat or a toque, again, depends on the weather and depends where you are. But you can get, really lightweight running toques. You don't need to throw on a big old school wool toque. You'll overheat for sure. But you can get really thin running toques, which are really nice to keep your head warm enough without being too hot. And same with gloves. Again, lots of companies making, really great gloves for running. They're a little lighter and yeah, they're just a nice protective layer. Usually when you're running, you heat up. I mean, if you just started, you'll notice that it might be cool outside, and within 5-10 minutes of running, you might be overheating. The body generates a lot of heat when we run, and so it's important to have thinner layers that you can remove and then put back on. Chafing cream, obviously, can't say it enough, and then nutrition belt or a running pack. Same in the winter. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the equipment side of things. I wanted to just touch briefly on shoes. Eh, you know, if I was doing this talk 5+ years ago, I probably still mention shoes, and in later episodes we're gonna talk about how to select the right shoe. We're gonna get an expert on who's gonna talk about the right shoe selection. What I'm talking about today is a bigger picture kind of overview of the different types of shoes we have now, and I'm going to keep it really simple and basically lump them into two different categories. I won't go into, shoes that are designed for pronation or, that kind of stuff. It's more just to identify. And if you've heard this term, we now have what are called carbon shoes or carbon plated shoes. And this is really quite a revolutionary step that the shoe industry has taken. Uh, Nike led the charge in this a few years ago when they set out to break the 2-hour marathon record. And in typical Nike fashion, they kind of pulled out all the stops and they said, okay, what do we need to do to get a human being to run under 2 hours for the marathon? Uh, for perspective, if you're new to running, that is a massive barrier that nobody had done. And in fact, they weren't even really close. Maybe they were, 203, 204, which sounds close, but really at that speed, like 3 minutes is a long way. It's like a full kilometer. So they had a few athletes and they thought, these athletes maybe have a chance to do this. What do we need to do? What do we need to put in place in order for them to have the best chance? And I'd encourage you to go, I'm sure it's on YouTube. I'd encourage you to go and look at, I think it was called the Nike Marathon Project or the sub 2 hour project. Remarkable what they did in terms of refining and tweaking the nutritional elements and the pacing elements and the time of day they did it, and having additional runners out there to help them pace. They had a pace car, partly for drafting reasons, I think. But one of the biggest innovations that came from that are what we call carbon plated shoes. So a normal shoe, which you'll see top left, basically is, any shoe that you've worn for the last, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. It has a soft sole on the bottom and it has an upper, and they're usually pretty lightweight and pretty comfortable, especially if they're for running. And they've come a long way. But with this new project, they're like, how can we get the most ground reactive force in the most positive way? And carbon technology's come a long way. So what they've actually done now is put a carbon plate in the shoe. So you'll see top right, a little hard to see there. Basically, the point of that is to show the different parts of the shoe. And you could take a normal shoe and it would look the same. The big difference here is you'll see that in the middle there's a dark gray band, and that's indicating the carbon plate. So they've basically taken a normal shoe and inserted a carbon plate into it. Now, what this does is it really gives the shoe a lot of I guess, rebound from the ground. So instead of landing on the ground and losing a bunch of energy, the carbon plate returns a bunch of that energy so that we run faster. And it is pretty much undisputable that these shoes have helped people's pace times improve. Um, I forget what the percentage is, but it's very, very significant. And of course, I think it was probably a couple of years ago now or more. They did succeed in breaking the 2 hour marathon record, um, and or the marathon barrier, which was a huge accomplishment. I don't think it's been done in what we would call like a traditional sanctioned race yet. This was under very controlled conditions. But this shoe was certainly a very, very significant part of it. Now, when you go to buy shoes, you do not need to get a carbon plated shoe, especially if you're a beginner. Now, if you're really stuck into this and you're going to do some races, then maybe, yeah, sure. And budget wise, you have to consider it. These shoes are not cheap. Typically, you're probably, for a normal shoe that does not have a carbon plate, you're probably looking at anywhere from 100 to 150 bucks ish. For a carbon plated shoe, you're probably looking anywhere from $250 to $400. So they are significantly more expensive, but the return on investment in terms of speed is very significant. I know if I was getting back into racing, there would be absolutely no question in my mind that I would use a carbon plated shoe. And tell my athletes, if they're racing and they're serious about it, even if they're in the age group categories, they're not, professionals, but they want to do really well in their age groups. I'm like, you cannot not have this type of shoe. It just makes a massive difference. So anyway, if you hear people talking about carbon shoes, that's what we're talking about. Another term you might hear, this is an important one to know, and I'm not going to tell you what you should do in this regard, other than you should go into a local running store and make sure that they have good people that look at you and look at your running gait and understand your history in running, whatever questions they need to ask, and then they will recommend the right shoe for you. We're going to talk about heel to toe offset. So that's a term that you might hear, and basically, the simplest way to think about it, or exactly what it is the difference in height between the heel and the forefoot. So you notice in this shoe, this example, it's kind of hard to tell with this one, but they're indicating a 6 millimeter difference from the height of the heel to the height of the toe. So let's think about it in extremes. Okay. So let's say you have high heels on. Okay. The heel to toe offset would be very dramatic in a high heel. So everybody can picture that. This is the exact same idea. It's just less extreme. So on the low end, you will find shoes that have a 0 millimeter heel to toe offset. And basically what that means is that the heel and the toe are at the same height. Okay. So years ago, we had sort of the barefoot running movement that swept through, and shoes really changed dramatically. And this was one of the things that the barefoot shoe kind of movement really pressed on, was that the heel to toe offset be the same, so that we were essentially running in bare feet. Well, when we're in bare feet, there's no heel to toe offset. We're not in anything that creates that. But it's not necessarily the case that everybody should do that. If you think about it, if there is a 0 millimeter heel to toe offset, every time you land, like let's say you land sort of with your whole foot on the ground, basically the Achilles, which is that tendon in the back that attaches to your heel, has to travel a little further. So again, let's use the example of high heels. If you're walking around in high heels, the heel of your foot never actually comes down to the ground. So it's a little more forgiving on the Achilles tendon. Now, am I saying go run in high heels? Absolutely not. What I'm saying is that runners of all shapes and sizes and abilities will have different needs, and you should go into a reputable shop, and they will give you, hopefully some good advice on what works for you. I know for me personally, I have found that a 4 millimeter offset, which is quite low, it's getting quite close to, a zero offset, or a barefoot shoe is the one that I prefer the most. If that heel to toe offset gets any higher, like if it's up around 10, 11, 12 millimeters, I don't like it. I don't like how it feels. My body just doesn't, I don't like it. And I've run long enough that I know, I'm not going to get into trouble with my calf and Achilles if the offset's a little bit less. But that's me. I know that sometimes the recommendation will be to get a higher offset, so 12, 14 millimeter offset if you are having calf or Achilles problems. It can sometimes alleviate that. But again, this is best left to the professionals. And if you are having calf and Achilles problems, you should seek out the advice first of a medical profession. So whether that's doctor, physio, whoever you trust in that space. And then, the experts at a shoe store usually will be able to help you with that. And then the other place you can go, which we're going to dive into in a second here, is getting a gait analysis. So somebody who really understands the biomechanics of running, who can look at you and decide, figure out what the problem is. If you have Achilles and calf problems, it's like a Band-Aid really to just slap a different shoe on there. It might help, but there's probably other issues that you should address. Anyway, for the sake of this chat, what I'm saying is just be aware that shoes have different offsets and be mindful of the ones that you get and make sure that they're appropriate for you. Okay, let's talk about some other terms that you might hear as you enter your journey into running. So one of them is foot strike. If you hear the word foot strike or the phrase foot strike, basically what they're saying is your foot is landing on the ground. Your foot is striking the ground. And that can be used in all kinds of different ways. So next term here is strides per minute. You might see it shortened to SPM. Now, if you looked at if you watched our previous webinar on bike lingo, this is essentially the same thing as what we would call RPM on a bike, or revolutions per minute. What we're talking about here is the number of times that foot hits the ground in a minute. Okay. So number of foot strikes per minute, or strides per minute, is a metric that we like to use. And coaches will have their own philosophy on what the ideal foot strike per minute is, or the ideal stride per minute is. Different people probably have, different tendency towards a certain strides per minute than others. Usually what we find in beginner runners is that the strides per minute is quite low. And one of the things that we like to correct a little bit is to move people in the upward direction in strides per minute. There's a number of reasons for that. One of them being that, like swimming, where your stroke length and stroke rate contribute to your speed. In running, it's the same idea. So your stride length and your strides per minute contribute to your speed. So that's one way to increase speed, is by increasing your strides per minute. You might hear these terms: heel, midfoot, and toe. So when you hear these, they're talking about where somebody generally is landing on their foot. Okay, so we have heel strikers. We have people that land on their heels. And traditionally, way back when, this was the norm. People would sort of throw the foot out in front of them and they land on their heel, and then they roll through the midfoot and they'd finish by toeing off, or going off of their toe. We've made a bit of a move now to kind of get rid of the heel strike, but some people still do it. Again, sometimes coaches will have their own philosophy around this. I definitely am a midfoot striker. I don't necessarily run on my toes unless I'm sprinting. Usually if people are sprinting, they're going to be up on their toes. Certainly if you watch the Olympic Games, the shoes even they wear are very toe dominant. They have spikes on the toes because shorter events, they're running basically on their toes. As the speed decreases, usually we'll move a little bit away from landing on the toe, and we'll land more midfoot, and some people still heel striking. So again, my own personal philosophy is that you should be landing more on your midfoot. I think landing on your heel is quite jarring. But it needs to be practiced. And yeah, that's a hotly debated topic sometimes, and I won't dive too far into that at this moment. Just for you to know that if you do hear heel, midfoot, or toe, generally they're talking about where is this person landing on their foot. So I wanted to just talk about the term gait because if you are new to this is probably a word you're going to hear coaches throwing around. You might see it, in articles. Gait or running gait. I actually did a little Google for it, and I have directly poached this from Wikipedia. So the reference here is Wikipedia. You can look it up. Um, if you're curious to dive a little deeper, definitely go on there. There's a bunch of links, and you can have a look. And I'm going to read you this term because it's quite in depth. It's probably going to be like, what is he trying to tell me here? And then I'll try and simplify it. So a gait is a pattern of limb movements made during locomotion. Human gaits are the various ways in which humans can move, either naturally or as a result of specialized training. Human gait is defined as bipedal biphasic forward propulsion of the center of gravity of the human body, in which there are alternate sinuous movements of different segments of the body with least expenditure of energy. Gait patterns are characterized by differences in limb movement patterns, overall velocity, forces, kinetic and potential energy cycles, and changes in the contact with the ground. So that's a pretty robust definition of gait. Here's what I will tell you. If someone is throwing around the word gait, basically they mean, what does your running technique look like? Now, there are certain technical cues that coaches will hopefully give you. If you're in person, certainly they're probably going to give you some technical cues. If you have an online program, maybe occasionally the coach is writing in some technical cues for you. What I will say is don't be overwhelmed by this definition of gait. Basically, they mean technique. Now, if you take this gait into what we call a gait analysis, let's say you go to a high-end lab somewhere, or you send a video to a coach and they do a gait analysis. What they're really doing is just looking in a little more detail and a little more refined look at what's actually happening to your body when you are running. Okay. And this could be everything from, what's your posture look like? Where are you landing on your foot? Are you pronating? Are you supinating? Like, are the feet collapsing in? Are they collapsing out? What does your stride look like? What does your stride length look like? I mean, there's so much going on in a gait analysis. If you do decide to go that route, hopefully you go with somebody who can take that complex idea and simplify it into a few technical things that will help you get better. So again, gait can be an overwhelming thing, but if you decide that you one day want to have a gait analysis, then now you have a broader picture of what they're actually talking about. So in a gait analysis, again, they might look at posture. They might look at the ground contact. So hopefully they have a good camera with some slow motion, and they're looking at what's actually happening to your foot when you land on the ground. This is a great way to get a really in-depth look at what kind of shoe might be the right shoe for you. Then they might look at parts of the running stride. So the recovery stride where, after you've landed on that foot, now the foot is coming up behind the body. That's like the recovery phase. And then the swing. So the leg is now swinging through and now you're landing on your foot again. So they might, in a gait analysis, look at the different parts of the running stride, which is helpful. And then as I mentioned before, they might look at stride length and stride rate and that kind of thing. They can kind of go down a whole bunch of different rabbit holes and give you a whole bunch of feedback if you do a good gait analysis. Okay, let's talk about some of the different terms you might hear for different workouts. So again, let's say you're with a running group or now you're getting an online program and they might throw a couple different terms at you for different types of workouts. So let's just go through the most basic ones. A recovery workout is typically very easy. On a scale of 1 to 10, an effort, maybe sort of 3 to 5 would be like a recovery pace. So very easy, but what I encourage people is to never be sloppy. So even though it's easy, be technically mindful. So if you have some technical cues that you're working on, even in a recovery run, you should be able to execute those technical cues. People get really hung up on pace all the time these days because we have constant feedback on what pace we're running with our smartwatches. In a recovery run, like you almost need to leave that thing at home. Okay. Like just go easy. Don't be worried about whether your pace was like the average pace was fast. Recovery run should be very, very easy. You would be absolutely shocked to see how slowly the top runners in the world run when they're doing a recovery run. It's very, very slow. And so you should as well, but you should be technically engaged and technically mindful. Endurance or base running, sometimes people will call it. This is like our longer, kind of slower runs on an effort scale, maybe like a 6 to a 7.5 out of 10. Um, and again, don't get too hung up on pace with these. Like in the winters, we usually run in trails where pace doesn't really factor in too much. We're just time on the legs, and you should be able to talk throughout. So if you're with your friends, you should be able to carry on a conversation for the entire run. If you're getting to the point where you can't carry on that conversation, you're probably going a bit too hard. It's a really easy way to measure if you're in the right place. A tempo run would be like faster than an endurance run or base run. Tempo run probably equates fairly closely to what most people would run a marathon at. Certainly, it's time dependent. So if you're a 3.5, 4 hour marathoner, you're probably kind of around what we call tempo. If you're one of the fastest runners in the world, you're probably running that thing closer to threshold. So it's a bit of a sliding scale. But tempo is, a term that coaches will use to define a specific type of workout. So they might give you, say, like 3 by 10 minutes tempo. And you might be like, well, what are they talking about? Well, this is a pace that's like you're not talking during this pace, but it's also sustainable. Okay. So you're you're running fast, but not so fast that you can't sustain it for 3 by 10 minutes or whatever the set is. So it's a pretty good clip. And tempo workouts are a staple in a lot of programs. Threshold. So if a coach throws a threshold workout out at you, they might be moving you or bumping you up really close to what your threshold is. Now, there's any number of ways to establish what your threshold is. Usually, in this case, we're talking about lactate threshold or your second ventilatory threshold. These are topics we're going to cover in later webinars. Just know that when you go beyond threshold, it is unsustainable. And when you are at threshold, it's really tough, but you can sustain it. So it's a little harder than that tempo workout, but it's like right on your limit. Some people call it redlining. Um, a threshold workout, that's probably, you know, up to about 5K pace. You're probably running right at your threshold or a little bit harder. When we start talking about VO2 work, VO2 stands for VO2 max, and basically this is the maximum amount of oxygen that your body can deal with or process at its highest kind of intensity. So when you're at VO2 max effort or VO2 effort, this is a very, very hard effort. This is unsustainable, and in those moments, if you really are at VO2 max, what you're doing is you're using the most amount of oxygen that your body personally can use. And VO2 max, obviously, again, sliding scale. So the top endurance athletes in the world will have a very high VO2 max, and what that means is they have the ability to use lots of oxygen. If you are out of shape or getting back into shape or you're brand new, your VO2 might be quite low. So the amount of oxygen that your body can actually process and use it might be is going to be quite a bit lower. And then speed work. If a coach throws the word speed work at you, usually this means very short, fast reps. Right. So today I just did some hill reps, 20-second hill reps. That would be speed work. I'm going up a very gradual incline, but I'm moving as quickly as I can, and it's a 20-second interval. So it's not really enough time to be breathing super hard. I am after. The main goal is to get my legs moving as quickly as I can. So that would be speed work. Okay. A couple other expressions you might hear: strides and accelerations. These are things that coaches will throw in maybe in a warm up or at the end of an easy run. A stride or an acceleration, they're two words to mean essentially the same thing. Basically, it's a 50 to 60, 70 maybe meter little run where you usually you're starting a bit slower and you're finishing fast. So we will include these in warm-ups as part of your activation. So to make sure the legs and the body are really ready to go for a harder set. We might include them at the end of a run as well. So if you've just done a recovery run or a longer endurance run and we want to finish with some faster running, this is a great way to do it. And usually we'll do 5 or 6 of them. Nothing to create any real training stress, but just like a little nervous system response to remind your body that fast running is good. They're also good for technical reasons as well. So, when you're running fast, some people get really lazy and sloppy when they're running slowly. But when we run fast, usually we engage a little bit more, and technically, it's a little nicer. Okay, last slide here. Couple real simple terms. Again, this is super basic stuff, but we have road running, and usually that means you're running on pavement. We have trail running. Usually that means you're running on trails. It could mean gravel roads, but basically the surfaces are quite a bit softer when we're on trails. If you have a hill workout, it means you're running up and down hills. If you're doing a track workout, this will mean that you are at a track, a 400-meter track or a 200-meter indoor track, and you're running round and round and round. And then the last term, intervals. If you have an interval workout, basically that means you're taking the run and you're breaking it up into smaller, manageable chunks. And it's pretty implicit in the word intervals that if you are doing intervals, it means you're doing shorter chunks faster. Otherwise, you're just doing a long endurance run. But intervals, we take a shorter increment of time or a specific distance, and our goal is to run fast in that and then take a little recovery, take a little break, and then do another interval so that we practice running fast. And that's a great way to get fast. Intervals are a really, really great way to get fast. If you dive down and really get stuck into running and you have a coach or a program, usually there's no doubt that at some point you're gonna have intervals to do, and they're fun. Great way to do a workout. Really great with other people. There's strength in numbers. It's lots of fun, and yeah, you'll get faster. Okay, that's all I got for you today. That was running lingo. Hope you join us next week. As we progress here, we're gonna get stuck into some topics that are a little bit higher level. So hopefully, if you have been doing this for a while and you have an interest in some higher level topics, you'll be joining us for those. Thanks, everybody, and have a great week. Happy training.